But there are many things that have frustrated me over the years, and I think I have answers for them that have worked for me, and I'm interested in sharing. There we go. There we go. Interested in sharing them. Actually, the real purpose of this is to make a clip for my YouTube channel because I wanted to have something put together for my vintage cube, which we'll talk about here, and how it's a product of what I think are flaws in typical vintage cube design, and what my goal is in doing that, and where that led me, and concrete answers to solving these problems. So I'm gonna say many things I've said before on stream, but this is the whole point of this for me is to comprehensively put it all together, and that way I can put it all in one place. I can link it to it on the Cube Cobra, and it'll be fun, you know. So I anticipate this will probably I have a tendency to go on. So I made these slides in order to give myself some kind of guardrails, but I do anticipate this taking something like 45 minutes, an hour and a half. So if you're interested in my thoughts on these, please hang out. If you're watching in the future because I've recorded this and I've done my due diligence, then you will see how long it will take, and you can, take that couple minutes to figure out if you want to hang out or not. This is not necessarily a strategic discussion, though some of it will inevitably have to deal with strategy. My days of thinking about strategy I think, are over. Really, you can think what you will of that, but I don't. I'm not particularly interested in that at this point. My goal in thinking about strategy in the past was to try to figure out how things worked and then how to use that information to design what I wanted to design, which is my cube. So, if you've heard some of this before, well, I guess thanks for hanging out in the past. So here I have the beginning. Right? So I have a cube that I call Modern Vintage. I call it that because I think we use very outdated models for how to build Cube in general, but in particular Vintage Cube. And I think we've never really reinvestigated how to fundamentally restructure these things in order to create a better gameplay experience. It's subtitled or kind of nicknamed Roast. The reason that is, to explain to give away the joke, is that it used to be called Vintage Cube Classic Roast. There's a long history of the name here. I do have another cube called The Study in Harmony, which originally was called Modern Vintage as well. And this cube that we'll be talking about right now was called Vintage Cube Classic Roast to differentiate the two. They both had power at one point. Study in Harmony no longer has power. What Modern Vintage does. It's called Roast because it's a shortening of Vintage Cube Classic Roast. I see here's a modernist approach towards building Vintage Cube. I think this uses a lot of the ideas that you would find in modernist art in the early 20th century. My own background is in literature and music and the arts in general and art history. So a lot of my thought process comes from that background. One of the things you could talk about in early 20th century work is how there's a desire to understand the mechanisms that influence the observer when experiencing art, and then rather than using the surface level things like whether it be representation in painting, whether it be the subject in literature, or the melody in music or tonality, rather than using the surface level things, we'll use the actual hidden mechanisms in order to directly affect the observer. Meaning, in short, you can think about non-representative art, abstract art, things like Vasil Kandinsky, and that would be the basic notion of when you look at a painting, you react to line, color, and shape. You don't react to what's being represented. So the idea for this is that if we better understand what is creating the experience that we have as players, we can use that information to build something better. Rather than iterate on the past, we will tear apart the past and build something new. So that's the basic idea here. If you want to look at the cube, we'll pull it up at some point in this discussion, but the cube cover idea is right there in Modern Vintage. That should be capitalized on the V. Cube cover is case sensitive, so I guess foul on me, but this is also not the best font for differentiating upper and lowercase. Regardless, it is Modern Vintage with an underscore and a capital V. And we'll be referencing two other cubes. My other cube is Study in Harmony, and then Storm Time, which is my storm-focused cube. Both of those cubes are very important to the final build we have here. So that's the mission here. So I guess then question is, why do I want to do this? I have been trying to, in my own position, fix Vintage Cube for a couple years. I think it's pretty flawed in its approach, as I said before. And I'm not here necessarily to convince you that my position is correct. I just want to share it with you and hopefully explain why I think these things. So here's a list of things as to why I think it's dissatisfactory as an experience. It's not particularly connected to Eternal gameplay. It doesn't feel like playing Legacy. It doesn't feel like playing Vintage. Whether or not that is a good or a bad thing is a personal decision, right? It never really had to. It didn't have the mechanisms to really do that. The cards weren't available. If we think about Vintage Cube in total, it's really rooted in these kind of lists that were created around 2010, 2011. Most important, the Magic Online Vintage Cube list, which comes out in 2011 the first time, I think. But there are predating ones that would have been available online. So there's a lot of things that were in those initial lists that really haven't lapsed in any way, and they affect the way we think about these things. But those lists really didn't play like Vintage and Legacy did. And we'll talk about what that means as we go along, but that's one thing that I wanted to try to fix. I think there's a lot of excitement to the gameplay of those formats that is kind of lacking in some ways in the way these cubes perform. But that's one of the ideas here. One other thing to think about here that was becoming increasingly obvious to me is that the metagame of available decks is just dwindling. Now, there's a lot of reasons that this is the case, and we can kind of go over this as we go, but there's really not a lot of things you can do, and it's not just the Magic Online Vintage Cube. If you look at other lists, right, there's just not a lot of things you can do. And you can draft some kind of Naya value deck, you can draft some kind of Tolarian Academy deck, right? You can draft some kind of Reanimator deck. And after that, it's really not much, right? That's if you go into my Discord channel, if you're there, you can check it out. There are links to it in the chat here, but there are also links to it on the Cube cover. And you go to the Trophy List channel, it's like the same 5 decks over and over and over and over. Now, I could see some kind of satisfaction in that if people are constructed players, because constructed is about refinement. But to me, this is not interesting or not fun. Like, to me, Magic is a game that has many possibilities to it, and I feel like they're all being left on the table. Going along with that, there's not a lot of gameplay patterns that we're experiencing. Most games go like deploy a threat, answer, deploy a threat, answer, deploy a threat, lose the game. And that's a pretty reductive, hey, thanks for following. That's a pretty reductive way to look at it, I understand, but the thing is the threats are so lethal. If you don't answer them immediately, you basically lose the game. And finally, I find the draft portion pretty dull as well, right? A lot of the time you're just finding out what colors you're in and then taking the cards in those colors. So these are my primary things that have always kind of irked me, and I think they've gotten progressively more dramatic over the last couple of years. And a lot of that has to do with the kinds of cards that are being played a lot. And it's pretty common among all these cubes. Now, the Magic Online one does serve as kind of like a tent pole for it. And everyone does look towards that in a sense. But you can look at other lists and find these cards too. So that's why I want to do this. I think there's a lot of possibility and a lot of fun to be had that's not being capitalized on. All right, so I'm not a very goal-oriented person. I tend not to think too far into the future. I tend to be more of an intuitive thinker. If you watch me play Magic, maybe that's very obvious. But still, we need to have some kind of goal if we are to try to figure out how to do, like, what are we trying to achieve here? So I've got 3 basic things here. They're very broad. Right? One is I want to create a cube about power. We'll go into what that means, but I think in general, most vintage cubes are cubes that contain power. I want to create a cube that's about power. So it, in totality, is focusing on this thing. It's important to me to remember that just like everything else that humans make, a cube is a mechanism, it's a creation, it's a machine, right? Just like a painting is a machine, just like a book is a machine, just like, a printing press is a machine. They all have functions, and they all have purposes. And if we don't understand what those functions are or what this machine is doing, then we can't really meaningfully change it. And also, if it doesn't have, if we can't figure out what that is, then we're just kind of flying in the dark here. So I want to create something. I want to try to understand what it is that we're doing on a total thematic level, and then make sure that what I'm doing is focusing on that element. Because that is the defining aspect of Vintage Cube, right? Is how it uses power, and that's a big discussion. But in short, here we'll use power in this particular minute to say that power is the power 9, right? How do we make a cube that has the power 9 in it, that is not just a bunch of cards with the power 9? How do we make it so that power 9 is both the focus and the totality of the cube? And then two other broad goals here. One would be, I want to maximize dynamic gameplay, and I want to maximize dynamic drafting. I want things to be as exciting as possible. Right? And I think those are quantifiable, and I think you can take concrete steps to get to those positions. So that's kind of what the goal is in this discussion here, and also in the project in total. So here I have 10 cards, and if you ask me, which is I suppose maybe why you're here, these are the 10 cards in Vintage Cube. There is Dark Confidant, which is some kind of 2-mana creature that replaces itself. There is a kind of value creature that affects the board as far as removes a permanent. There is a threat that generates more threats for no mana investment. There is a 1-mana removal spell. There's a counter spell. There's a draw spell. There's a Plague Wind of some kind. There's some kind of giant mana generation like Tolian Academy. There's reanimation spells in particular. And then there's Archon of Cruelty and a couple other things. If you look through these lists that are available, you can really funnel most of the cards that are not mana into one of these 10 categories. And again, I understand that these are very, very broad subject, like very, very broad categories. But I hope to show there are ways in which like these particular cards end up decreasing the amount of gameplay we can have rather than increasing it. And as a result, like if these kind of categories get overloaded, then it ends up with a more boring game to me. Right? What can we say about these things is they require no additional mana investment, they provide consistent value, or are highly efficient. And that's good. I mean, that's why we want to play with them. But there's more to Magic than this, right? So what else is there? This is, to me, these are just a sample of some of the effects that are missing that are iconic to Magic. Right? Here, some of these have seen play recently in Magic. Only Vintage Cube had Berserk in the cube in the last season, which is sadly gone now. But there's other big effects, and these are not like strange, unusual effects. These are effects that see play in, at least have seen play in Legacy or Vintage, right? Or have defined these kind of eternal gameplay formats. So this would be big spells, like a big enchantments like Omniscience, Omnitel, things like that. There's these Replenish, which is no longer kind of in vogue, but there are some kind of Replenish, cheaty decks. There's the kind of Rector. Lantex is gone now, but was a power player even recently in formats like Old School, right? Food Chain. There's all kinds of Food Chain decks. My point is that these combo cards that really aren't present in the cube anymore, or never were. They never really were capitalized on. So, to me, what are the defining differences on these to the previous cell here, which is that these are kind of straight up basic interactive cards or basic threats, and then these are kind of transmutive threats or transmutative cards. These are cards that let us do something outside of the bounds of the regular game, whereas these cards function within the regular game itself, perhaps with the exception of Reanimate. So I think when we don't explore these things, we are really missing a huge chunk of the game, and we are losing out because of it. And these aren't, like I said, if you look through Legacy and Vintage, now, maybe not these particular cards, but there will be some kind of combo deck that uses something that transforms an element of the game rather than just accrues value, something that manipulates the rules of the game. And so one of my goals in this was to make these cards good and make these cards playable. And that comes with a lot of design decisions that has to be made. So then Yeah, Arbok, that's a good point. Veteran, Explorer, Learn. Oh, we've discussed a Learn for this cube as well. So if we're going to make this thing that is about power, we have to talk about what power is. You could be a little bit pedantic here. Power literally is a stat in the game. The only place that power is defined in Magic is as a stat on a creature. But that's maybe being a little too direct. In the cultural sense, power is referring to the particular 9 cards in Alpha, which I'm not going to list them here. You know what they are. But even that is kind of weird because you got Soul Ring and Mana Crypt, and they're technically not in there. But the point is, like, it's a word that is ephemeral. It's a word that really doesn't have a definition with regards to Magic. I have a lot of discussions about how to make the game fun and what is fun, and I find that when you push on that subject with people, they tend to push back and don't want to engage, and they say, well, fun is subjective and fun is different for different people. And I would argue that power is also subjective and power is different for different people. And we can think about why that might be the case. So, one is, depending on your personality type and your perspective as a player, you will consider powerful things to be different than a different person. Right? So some people might think of power as being able to be really proactive in a sense, right? Some people maybe think of power as having infinite resources, whether that be a ton of mana or infinite cards, or they think of power as being be able to end the game really quickly, right? Other players may think of power as being like highly restrictive in nature, like control players in general. People that have the personality type that wants them to play 4 Force of Wills, 4 Dazes. They can think about disrupting their opponent's mana. In fact, if you look at the deck types in Legacy, you can see each of the different decks kind of outlines a different conception of what power is. And to say that it's singular in nature is kind of just to ignore that there's different ways to play the game. So I think in that sense, it's not really easy to nail down power because already we're working from a fractured viewpoint. I think when I see people talk about new cards for Cube or evaluating cards for Cube, the question is always, is it good enough? It's always, is it powerful enough? And I hope in some way to show that that's not really a good question to ask, and maybe offer some other questions that you could ask instead of that. But that's not really going to get you anywhere, because all it is going to do is reinforce whatever perspective you were coming from in the first place. In addition to that, power is contextual. It's definitely possible to make a cube where the best card in this cube that we're playing, let's say the best non-actual power card, which maybe is something like Broadside Bombardiers. It's not, but let's just take that card. Right? You can say, well, this card is really good, this card is really powerful, it's the most powerful card. It's really easy to make a cube where that's just awful, right? You could put 100 shocks in the cube. Right? So, or if your cube is highly artifact oriented, you could put a bunch of collector oofs in the cube. So the context that we're talking about the cube has a direct correlation to what the power of a card we're putting in is. And this is, I think, considered by people, but I think that the larger global context of it is maybe a little less pondered on, which is to say that there really is no context. Right? This isn't a fixed format. We have total control over what cards are available, without the exception of saying we want to play particularly with alpha power. So those, with just that small restriction there, that everything else is kind of on the table. There have been many different ways. That's not true. There has been at least 1 or 2 other ways to make cubes with power. You can think of Caleb Gannon's power cube that was on Magic Online in like 2019, which was a great cube. So there are different ways to frame these things, and to think about a singular card in isolation is not really going to get us to where we need to be as far as evaluating whether or not we want to play with the card. So then the next question I want to ask is, like, why does it matter? Why does it matter that this card is powerful? Like, why do we want to play with the best possible cards? Even if we could determine what the best possible cards are, which I don't think we can, right? You could even use data analysis if you wanted to, but that is a very arcane thing to get into. Like, you're talking about player skill, people playing it, you're talking about all the variables involved in that, and the actual cube list. But even if we could figure out what the best cards were, why do we want to do it? There are some things that I think get overlooked sometimes, which is I think there's a tendency to think of I want to play the best cards because it it's the most testing. Any format is skill testing, right? So any format will challenge you, and then generally the better player will win, right? Magic is a pretty random game, so your skill is not necessarily going to translate into victory, but it's there's no reason to think that like playing with only the best cards, quote unquote, is going to be any more challenging than anything else. Right? There will always be a winner. There will always be a loser. The quality of the cards involved is not related to that at all. So it would be good to ask yourself why do you want to play with the best cards, and maybe you can find an answer, and that answer would lead you in a good direction. But the just that question, I think, should highlight that there's not enough questions being asked because wanting to just play with the best things is it's like the step number one, right? Armath, you point out if you want skill tested, play IPA only. That's true. There is something to be said for like the more decisions you make in a given game, the harder it's going to be because there's the more opportunities for failure. And we can talk about IPA in a minute. So there's some basic questions about what is power. So here are some cards that are generally considered extremely powerful in the context of Vintage Cube, but just in general. Right, Broadside Bombardiers and Minsc and Boo have been huge players in the last 2 years. Palace Jailer a little bit outdated at this point, but still a good card. And these are considered some of the best cards in Vintage Cube. And I would rate them there too, right? It's hard to deny. They frequently lead to winning. If you looked at stats related to them, they would be high. But what is different about them if we think about the format? One thing I would say is that they tend to be the kinds of cards that would perform well in Standard. I understand that these cards have all seen play in Legacy, and currently Broadside Bombardiers is a great Legacy card. I don't know if Minsc and Boo is being played as much as it anymore, and I know Palace Jailer is a little too outdated to be good there. But my point is, these are creatures with value abilities at 3 to 4 mana. These are Standard cards. These are way too good to put in Standard, but the basic model of them is that they are a card that was the playing Standard, which is a creature with a value ability that is aggressive in some manner. Palace Jailer is not aggressive, but they provide persistent value for no additional mana investment. I guess you could say Broadside Bombardier kind of doesn't fit that, but they are, again, the kind of cards you would see in Standard. Standard is usually a bunch of removal and then threats that generate additional value. Right? But if you think about older formats like Modern and farther back, that less and less becomes the case. So what other kinds of cards could we consider powerful? So if you look at older formats, you have cards like Force of Will, Doomsday, and Bazaar Baghdad as being centers of power, and they are very, very different from the kinds of cards that you would see as good in Standard. There is something to be said for recently in the last couple of years, there's been an infiltration in a sense of a Standard style card in Legacy and Vintage with the addition of Initiative and cards like Broadside Bombardiers and Minsc and Boo. Mainly commander cards, right, that are legal in these older formats. And there's a lot of reasons that is the case, but one of the reasons that it is because they do so much damage. Right? They end the game so quickly. But in general, those older formats are more defined by cards like Force of Will, Doomsday, and Bazaar Baghdad. There are others as well we could put here, but these are just some examples. And they are, in a gameplay perspective, quite different than the other cards. Right? One, it lets us use spells for no mana. Another allows us to, you can't see what I'm pointing at, okay. Force of Will allows us to convert cards in hand into mana. Doomsday allows us to restructure the game in the moment, meaning I can take my deck and rearrange it in a set way, which is more or less cheating, right? It's something you're not allowed to do in the game rules, so Doomsday allows you to change the game rules. And then Bazaar Baghdad, similar to Force of Will, allows you to convert resources. But it also gives you some kind of card fluidity. It's a land it's difficult to disrupt. It's transmutive in nature, as is Force of Will, and it lets you take something and then convert it into something else. Bazaar Baghdad, when it's used fairly or unfairly, whatever you want to say, its purpose is not to like find additional cards. Its purpose is to be a mana engine for Delve, to put cards in the graveyard that you'll get back for free, and generally move through cards to put things in the graveyard and move. So what it's doing that's powerful is changing the structure of the game rather than committing threats at a lower mana cost. These cards here, while they have seen play in Cube, are less important players than the cards like the Bombardiers and Minskin. I'm not saying Force of Will, Doomsday, or Bazaar Baghdad are bad by any means, and they've all had their fair share of victories. Force of Will probably being the most common, but until recently, Doomsday wasn't even legal in legal, quote unquote, wasn't even in Vintage Cube, right? Thanks, bicycles. Maybe I'm just talking a lot. My mic is as high as it normally is. And Bazaar was in forever, but it didn't really do much. It wasn't leveraged as any way to be an engine of any kind. It was just like, I'm going to discard cards and reanimate them. So if we want to have a format that functions more like Vintage and Legacy, it will have to, in some way, make these cards more applicable and more common and good. Yeah, and as Badger points out, they need a lot of support, which is they need more or less the game components that are available to be moving in this direction. So that brings up a question, like if we can say from a data standpoint that cards that are more like standard cards tend to lead towards victory more than cards like Doomsday or Bazaar Baghdad, how can we put these two things together in a way that doesn't lead towards just playing standard decks over and over? And we could talk about what an actual power is versus the feel of power. And it'd be easy to say that power is what lets us win, but I want to pose the idea that power is a feeling and it's not about an outcome. So what do I mean? Like for Force Will, it'd be good if it... So here are two images here. First on the left is Superman. I think this is by John Byrne, right? So I use these two images here to talk about ideas of perception on the viewer as they experience a piece of art. On the left here we have our one true hero, Superman, right? I grew up with a friend, one of my gaming mentors, used to use the term Superman black all the time. And it was, Superman's hair is so black that it's blue. And it kind of shows that sometimes in order to make something greater than is actually possible within the setting, you have to make it lesser. Blue is not black, in fact it's lighter, but having this blue in the hair makes it feel darker as a viewer. On the right here we have a painting of Patrick Nagel, most famous for, this is the cover of Rio by Duran Duran, right? But painter in the 80s or artist in the 80s, I'm not sure if these are paintings or not, but artist in the 80s that was most known for this line work and these kind of really minimalistic depictions of the face. And they're interesting to consider because they pose to us that the face is simply 6 shapes. Maybe 6 shapes contained within one other shape. It's an oval that contains 2 eyebrows, 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth. And while we know that that's not really what the face looks like, when we see the painting, it affects us as if we're seeing a human face. And there is some degree of truth to that your brain is capable of taking a face and deconstructing it and understanding the shapes on it, and then it uses that construction of shapes to recognize, oh, that's a face. And what's that? Never mind. But there are processes in which we take outside experiences and then take information and ingest them and simplify them in order to understand them. So we can maybe use this information about how we experience things to try to create something that is more than it is. So if we can't create a format by just rating by win rate or by actual rate cards, that recreates the feeling of these legacy or vintage formats. Maybe we have to get about it in a roundabout way. So this kind of comes to this idea of outcome versus process. Right? Do you think about power as the thing that leads you to the outcome? Or do you think about power as your ability to influence something? So if we think about a card like Archon of Cruelty, right? Archon of Cruelty comes into play, most likely your opponent loses the game that turn or the turn after, right? That happens a lot of the time with that card. You could easily point to that card and say that card is powerful, right? And as a result of this card, I won the game. But then if you take a card like Food Chain doesn't really do anything, right? But given the certain circumstance, it gives us the power to influence and change the game in a way that we didn't have before. And because of that, we can exert additional control over the game and additional control over the resource system in order to create an outcome that we wanted. You could say the same thing for pitch spells, right? Free spells allow us to change the resource system of the game. Or delve spells, right? I can set up scenarios in which I'm able to manipulate and restructure the resource system of the game to get an outcome that's not possible at that given point in time. This is true for any kind of cost reduction. This is true for alternate costs. This is true for really free spells of any kind, which is just largely going to be cost reduction or alternate costs. Those allow us to interact with the game in a way of additional control, not in a sense of like control as in metagame, but a control as in us literally interacting with the rule system and breaking the barriers that we are normally bound by. So is power something that wins the game, or is power our ability to influence the game? And I think what's interesting about Vintage and Legacy a lot of the time is it's the latter. It's our ability to circumvent the mana system of the game. If you think about using Daze or Force of Will or Bazaar of Baghdad and Dredge, right? All these decks that don't use the mana system at all, or that very rarely use the mana system, they allow you to kind of override the basic controls of Magic. Right? And as a result, they give you power. So I guess I would posit that there are cards that are powerful that you can be in the presence of. And that would be Broadside Bombardiers, that'd be Minsc and Boo, that'd be Archon of Cruelty, that'd be the Flametongue Kavu, right? Or there are cards that give you power. And the cards that give you power are the ones that let you change the way the game is played. So that's where I wanted to move in building this cube, which is a cube that grants power back to the player. I have a long-standing grudge against value creatures, particularly ETB value creatures, which I guess they're just enters value creatures in the future. And I've, for a long time, felt that they take agency away from the players. Now, they do literally give you options by coming into play, Flametongue Kavu being the most iconic one, in a sense, like comes into play and kills something. But they took away an opportunity for you to create something for yourself. Right? They play the game for you. And I'm not saying you're a worse player. I'm not saying they're a stupid card. I'm just saying that's the effect they have on you as a player, is that they took away an opportunity for you to change the game in a sense, and they did the work for you. It's reasonable to want to play those cards because they almost are by default better, and in a sense of moving towards winning the game. And we can talk about some of that as we go along here. So the other goal for this is to create a dynamic game, whether it be drafting or whether it be gameplay itself. And so if that is the goal, we have to figure out, like, what does that mean? What does it mean to be dynamic? And I have three basic things here, which is dynamic gameplay and dynamic drafting rewards action. I think there's a lot of games, and Magic included, that really reward conservative play, and that they make it so taking risks is bad. This sounds obvious, right? Like, risks can in general mean you are moving into an opportunity for failure. You want to minimize your opportunities for failure. But it can frequently be that taking no action is the best action. And that should be good sometimes. You don't want to just force action the entire game. But you do want the game to move forward. At least I do. Right? And I get frustrated when the game is just people taking no action for a long period of time. This is not some kind of anti-control bent. I just think that the game should have motion to it. Similarly, if you want to reward action, you need to reward risk taking, right? And that could be dangerous because it could lead to a situation that snowballs. But you do, to me, want the game to be inventive in a sense. And we could talk about combos, or we could talk about synergy decks and things like that. People don't like to draft them because they think they're too risky, um, and they think they won't work, and they can be a little more challenging to play as well. And some of those things are difficult because there are learning processes, but I think a lot of the time cubes are set up in a way that punishes people for trying to do something inventive. In that sense, trying to take a risk. And that can be, I think, a lesser gameplay experience because to me, we should always be trying to experience the most novel situations as possible. Magic can be a game that's about refinement, but it is really the most articulated game ever created by humans. I struggle to think of another game that has as many game components or has as many individual articulations to the rules, individual exceptions to the rules, other than maybe a digital game of some kind, I'm not sure. But certainly any board game or card game, there's really nothing with as much intricacy of the rule set as this, and there's and nothing with as much ability to interact with the rule set as Magic. And that, to me, should be explored rather than reduced. And frequently, there are game setups, meaning the cube lists and cards we play with, that reduce the ability to investigate these possibilities, and they also punish risk taking in a sense. Constructed frequently can feel like this to me, that the more inventive things end up being punished by the more simple things. And then finally, we want to reward adaptability, meaning want to reward situational awareness both in gameplay and in the draft portion. So, what does that mean? It means we want someone who's able to understand what's going on, to give them the opportunity to change their possibilities in lane, and also the opportunity to make a difference in area. That's always true. You always have the options to adapt, but want to maximize them. So one way to do this with regards to the draft, and this is something that will affect the draft and the decks and therefore the gameplay, is to kind of make sure that we are not bringing in baggage from other areas. So if you've hung around for some amount of time, you know that I really dislike the word archetype as it pertains to Magic in general, but particularly as it pertains to draft. I want to emphasize that there really is no archetype in the game. There's no game component that is an archetype. There's no restrictions about what you can and can't play other than what is legal. Right? That the concept of archetype is something that we layer on top of the game to try to understand it better, but it is not part of the game. And everything you can ask about an archetype will ultimately be a question about a card. And to me, if we have this thing that we're going to ask about, if we ask about archetypes, and that ends up leading to asking about cards, why would we bother asking about archetypes? Let's just ask about the cards. But there are other competing games to Magic that this does work for, right? For fighting games, every character themselves is an archetype. They have a set skill list, a set tools available to them. For games like even other digital card games like Hearthstone, there are hard barriers on what you can play, whether the classes in Hearthstone, or there are MOBAs where you play a character that has a finite set of things that they can do. And in those senses, you're talking about a limited toolkit that you have to play with and you have to understand, and therefore, like, understanding it as a fixed thing is reasonable. But Magic is not a fixed system. Magic is restricted by its mana, right? But we could talk about how the mana available in Cube is very good now. But to take it, the idea that these things are fixed, and then to try to layer it means we're going to miss something. We're going to miss something as a player, but we're also going to miss something as a designer. Some of this comes in from Constructed, and in Constructed, in a practical sense, it's reasonable to talk about archetypes. Right? This goes all the way back to net decking as an idea, that there are these pretty solidified possibilities of best possible things. But even recently in Standard, there have been people rewarded for finding new things beyond what is considered as the given decks. So I think there's a lot of approaching Cube from a perspective of the decks that we bring in from Constructed. But on the other hand, retail draft has frequently been organized by archetypes since at least Innistrad, right? Innistrad brings in a bunch of 10 two-color pairs, and they each have a kind of distinctive play style, particularly the ally color pairs, which have tribal in nature, right? You have humans, spirits, zombies, vampires, and werewolves back in Innistrad. And that model ends up becoming the basic model for draft set design until today, really. And then layered on top of that, starting in Theros, you have the signposts called uncommons that kind of tell the players, these are what these colors do in this set. And there is a kind of restrictive nature to this thing, and that's been a complaint about this style of design. Since its inception, there are players that thought that Innistrad was too restrictive on what the color pairs can do. On the other hand, there are good reasons to use this, we'll talk about in a second. But a cube is not a draft set, it just is a set of cards that is drafted. I think it's important to try to figure out what the possibility of the unique format of cube is, and to address that not as if it's constructed and not as if it's retail draft, but to address it directly and to understand what is the unique possibility of playing with 540 singleton cards. We could talk about playing with 360 cards, you could talk about breaking singleton. I choose to use 540 cards on my list. I don't break singleton. That's the kind of basic restriction I put on myself, and that's really about it. So I always try to emphasize to people, if they're thinking about archetypes as far as their draft decks, then they are leaving something on the table. There's something else they could have done. And when someone asks, is this card good in mono red, I would just challenge them to think, is this a good card you would play in the deck that you have? Now, that can end up being a little teacherly in a sense, meaning that it's kind of like, well, what do you think? And I get that that's not particularly helpful, but I do think it's important to understand that your draft pool is not finished until you draft your 45th card, so you can't really determine too much about it until you get until the end. So then, if archetypes have these kind of negative effects, meaning they are rigid in a sense, why would we use them at all? I think there's this idea that Magic will create unique opportunities on its own, and it will. The cards have a bunch of abilities to them and a bunch of text on them, but in general, they don't, actually. There's an interview with the guitarist named Fred Frith, who's a free improvisation player, and he said that a lot of people think about free improv as being these like lots of moments of excitement and possibility at all times, but in reality it's like 95% boring and then 5% exciting. And that's just the nature of that kind of music. I think the same is true for Magic, really. Like, it's, if you just put a bunch of random cards together, the opportunity for them to do something unique and interesting is quite low, actually. And unless you really cultivate it, then nothing out of the ordinary is going to happen. And then we could go back to that list of 10 cards, which is, Swords to Plowshares, Flametongue Kavu, Tidings, and Reanimate. Those will end up dominating because they don't need other things. And the cards that need other things are just not going to get there. So there has to be some kind of cultivation of interactive and synergistic elements in order for it to work. So the reason that you'd use an archetype is to create some kind of gameplay that's not just mid-range battles. I think it's very frequent for people to complain about Cube in the last couple of years and just say it's mid-range slugfests. I again challenge them to define what that means, but I do get what they're saying, which is they are attrition battles that are based on creatures that replace themselves and removal spells. Or if they're not that, then they end up being some kind of big mana combo deck. Right? So in order to make it so it's not just that over and over and over and over, there has to be some kind of attention given to the possibilities that are there for players. The downside is that it leads to some really kind of rigid scenarios from a draft perspective, and and it also leads to less interactive gameplay. In the fall, and I think it was really in the winter, right? You had the beginning of the packages, I guess now era of the Magic Online Vintage Cube, where you had artifacts and you had the Power Matters thing and you had the Bizarre Baghdad stuff. And those were added in, and a common complaint was that it felt too much like something inserted in that was just a preset package, and you just got all those cards, or you didn't get those cards, and it didn't really interact with other stuff. Lands was like this too, the kind of Valakut exploration stuff. And there is a lot of truth to that, though there were opportunities to brew, quote unquote, with them, but largely there were big, sweeping packages of cards. And because they're so unique in nature and they're looking for very specific things, they didn't frequently interact with other cards that were available, and therefore you just either I'm drafting lands or I'm not. Right? And it didn't really blend well. So it meant that if you determined that you were the lands player and in pack one, then you just got all the cards. This leads to a downside in the gameplay as well, because those kinds of decks, if they get quote unquote get everything for them, they tend to be highly uninteractive, right? If someone is getting all of the artifacts for the Tellurian Academy deck, there's really not a lot you can do to stop them. I tend to play myself mid-range decks when playing Magic Online Vintage Cube, and I have lots of interaction, lots of removal, and sometimes it doesn't really matter. Like, you can come into the table with 6 or 7 Shatters, and you can just never outpower the Tellurian Academy deck, because they're generating so much mana so fast that nothing you do can really stop them from doing it. And the reason they're able to get that many artifacts is because there's not a lot of other things to do with them. So, 5 or 6 years ago, people would take all the signets to play their 4-drops early, but now the mana curve has lowered a little bit, and 3 mana cards are more important, and there's not really as much of a need for talismans or signets in general decks anymore, which means that if someone cares about artifacts, they're just going to get all of them. And as a result, they have a deck that is tough to interact with because it's highly redundant, and it's extremely repetitive, right? That deck's going to be the same deck every time because they just get all the cards. One of the things about Cube and one of the things about Draft that's interesting is the kind of variation to it, right? One thing that Cube that is even potentially more interesting than that is the ability to explore the kind of variations that are possible within a wide range of cards, not just a singular set. So you use archetypes because they provide you other lanes of play, other than just kind of insert removal or AB combo, but they do have this big downside of when you're drafting them, it's kind of boring, right? And when you are playing the game, it's not particularly interactive. Still, you need something to add a little flair to the game. I think it's important to try to think about Magic in comparison to other games, particularly the other card games that predate it. And really, if we're thinking about other card games that predate it, we're talking about plain deck card games, so like Spades and like Bridge and Gin and games like that. It's really not a lot like Magic before it exists. And then after it, there's plenty of other card games of the various iterations of Magic. But before that, there's really nothing. So what differentiates Magic as a game from those other Spades or from Bridge or things like that is it has, to me, the big thing is it has like a tripartite element to it. Because I put here the three-part harmony of Magic. Right? And in music, you need 3 notes to make a chord in general. So here we can think about it as a basic harmonic element to the game. So that means that there are present threats, there are potential threats, and then there are combinatory threats. So let me explain what I mean here. Present threats are creatures on the table, or whatever it is, it's most of the time a creature that is threatening to end the game right now. Maybe not this turn, maybe not next turn, maybe not 2 turns, but it will end the game if not stopped. Potential threats are cards that are in our hand in general, and combinatory threats are things that will be expansively amplified when in the presence of another card. And I would argue to a degree that you're not really playing Magic at its most, at its highest form, unless you have a combination of all these 3 things occurring at the same time. It's not just that I need an answer for your creature, but I need to weigh whether or not I need to kill this threat or whether I need to stop you from assembling this combination of things. if we take out the combinatory element, meaning some kind of synergy or some kind of combo, then we're moving back to a game that's closer to hearts or spades, right? Where someone leads a suit, and then you either have a higher or a lower card in that suit, so you have some kind of play in that suit, or you have no play, which means don't have the card in the suit, or you have a trump, right? And that kind of, to me, describes the gameplay patterns of threat answer, threat answer, threat answer, so on. And that's a mid-range gameplay pattern, which is I'm going to present you a threat, and then maybe you have an answer or don't. That's the same as, do you have a higher card in the suit that I led? But what's unique about Magic is that my cards care about other cards that I have, not just your cards. There are sequential strategic elements to games like Spades, but there's not a lot of this card makes this card in my hand better. It does by virtue of eliminating other possibilities for my opponents, but me having the 7 of Spades doesn't particularly make the 8 of Spades better, other than that in sequence they might be good to play together. It's not like they turn into something fundamentally different. I asked on Twitter the other day, like, are suited connectors in poker synergistic? Are they combo cards? Where are they? Like, that's the unique thing about Magic, is that when we have these multiple pieces in the same place at the same time, we create new opportunities. And I think that element, that element is frequently reduced to almost zero in the way that cubes are generally produced. You could say that something like Splinter Twin effects, whether it be Entomb Reanimate, or whether it be Splinter Twin, or whether it be Brain Freeze and Underworld Breach, those are there. But I think those end up playing more like potential present threats, which are like this thing that you must stop right now or you lose. It's not like something that's going to gain a lot of additional value. Yeah, our math, I think we're in the same place, yeah. So, over the course of the, I guess that's explaining the kind of, again, the three-part nature of Magic that's interesting to me. So, talking about specifically drafting, how do we make drafting more exciting? I think there's a lot of draft strategy that has this kind of traditional, which is like trying to determine from signals what colors you should be in, trying to find the right ratio of removal spells and mana and threats and things like that. But they tend to be rather dry decisions. I think most of the time when you're presented with a pack, after pack 3 or 4 in your opening draft, there's not a lot of options to have, right? There's like 2 or 3, maybe 4 cards you might pick. And frequently you're just doing a kind of raw rate calculation, like this card is better than this card, or this card is, I need this card for my mana slot or something like that. You're not frequently making a decision based on a larger synergistic deck building element. It's more about like, how many answers do I have? How many threats do I have? How much mana do I have? And also, like, what is my seed? What is the deck I should be drafting? If we think about what deck should I be drafting, we immediately fall back into this idea of archetypes, right? Like that, oh, I'm the Reanimator deck. Well, there is no Reanimator deck. There are just cards that lets you reanimate cards in the graveyard. And the more you think about it as being a archetype, the more you'll fall into this drafting as a portion of figuring out which deck is being given to you. But I think drafting can be that plus a deck building element. And I think that's what I wanted to explore here. So traditionally, the farther you go in a draft, the less tension there is while playing the draft portion. Meaning that most of the risks are dwindling over time. Right? That I'll make high risk decisions early in the draft, but just due to the process of elimination and everyone else kind of figuring out where they are, then after a certain point, everything gets kind of sorted out, and then the rest of the draft is just us sorting the cube out. And this kind of happens in retail draft as well, but it doesn't for some other reasons. And I think that's a model of falling tension, right? So if we think about games as a kind of story experience from a player perspective, it's interesting to have tension continually rise to a kind of climax rather than the tension fall over time. Now, as a player, you're rewarded for falling tension because you likely have more control and more movement. You're able to move closer towards victory. But I think one of the things we could talk about is how designing a cube is different than playing a cube. And If we build a cube or a format based on the idea of victory, then we are fundamentally misunderstanding what we're doing. You cannot win at designing a cube, right? You can win as a player, but you can't win while designing the cube. So it would be bad to take that into it. So like there are things that players want, like consistency, that actually I think take away from the dynamic of playing the game. But they want it, and it's reasonable to want it because it leads towards winning. So we get into this idea of like, is the role of the designer to help the player or is it to challenge the player? And I would offer that it's to challenge the player, right? And in the challenge, you find the excitement. If it's to help the player, then you can make an environment like that, but I would say it's going to be less exciting. Right? So, as I said, I think draft, particularly the tension and excitement of it gets less and less as the draft progresses. This is unavoidable. There are fewer decisions in the pack as you get farther in the pack, but I think it can still be exciting down to the last pick. To me, ideally, a draft it should be exciting from pick 1 to the last play of the third round. And so the goal then is like, how do we make that happen? So is it possible to make drafting have a constant level of tension? Is it possible to make drafting like crossing a rope bridge as it's falling? I think you can get close. So how do you do it? Ultimately, this leads towards the cube I'm working on, this modern vintage cube. And I built this cube in a different process than other cubes I built. In A Study in Harmony, which is one of my previous cubes, the colors are broken up roughly into Kahn's wedges, and each of those wedges has a mechanical identity to them, whether it be graveyard or artifacts or enchantments and so on. Now, I put a lot of work into making sure that you can blend those as well as you can together, but they do tend to be larger themes to them. And I think that led me to a lot of interesting places, but it does make it feel kind of samey over the while, right? Like there's an enchantment deck or there's an enchantment artifact deck, and you could blend these things together. You could have your graveyard deck that also cares about lands, but it still felt like basically there are 5 things you can do and you can mix and match them in some way. And that part of that's because that's how it was designed. I had these 5 big areas of the gameplay that you could play in, and you could mix and match them, but you were still ultimately kind of stuck with these big global ideas. And with this cube, I wanted to explore a different way of building a cube. So I more or less called this card maximization, and it comes back to another idea I've talked about before, the idea of packages versus networks. So can you make a cube that's about maximizing particular cards? And if so, what does that look like? And why would you want to do that? The idea here is to just divorce ourselves from the idea of archetype entirely and say that there's nothing that any 2 colors should be doing. There's no deck that you should be drafting. There are just opportunities for you within this. I think from what I've seen other players talk about, this is desirable to them, that they want to be in a position where they can find a unique way that expresses themselves within the system to make a deck. But I've not seen a lot of places that you can do this. This is the desire of Chaos Draft to an extent, right? Like when you play Chaos Draft, you have 3 unrelated packs or 24 unrelated packs, and you'll find some special way to put them together. But as I said earlier, I don't think that magic really kind of happens. People expect these kind of special things to occur in the process of a Chaos Draft, but most of the time those decks are like blue-white flyers or like a red aggressive deck or things like that. They don't actually have too many unique and interesting things that happen within them because magic isn't real. And I don't mean the game, I mean magic, right? Like things happen because people put work into them, not because they're random. You could say that the random things happen out in the world, and that's fine, But like as far as a artistic structure, someone put it together. Now there can be happy accidents, but for the most part, the success of a craft is because someone put work into it. So you have to have some kind of structure that makes it so there are possibilities. And what I've done over the last year with this particular cube is to find a way to have it be card focused rather than deck or archetype focused. And so that relies to a degree on the idea of packages versus networks. What I say here is like, there's no artifact package, there's no reanimator package, there's no twin package, whatever it may be. There are just some cards that are made to be used and efficient in a variety of ways. So realistically, this means taking groupings of cards that are like 20 to 25 cards and reducing them down to groupings of cards that are 5 or 6 cards. But you make them related enough that they can mix together with other groups of 5 and 6 cards and other groups of 5 and 6 cards, and they can be done in new and novel ways on a repeated basis. There are really not that many things you can do in Magic. Right? It seems like the game is full of all these things that you can do because there are roughly 30,000 cards. But let me find this. There's not a lot of actual different game mechanics you can interact with. There's a lot of instantiations of that, meaning there's a lot of different ways in which they actually have rules text, but there's not a lot of ways in which they actually meaningfully affect the game. Here I have, you can think about it. Cards can move zones, they can cause other cards to move zones, they can monitor zones, they can modify other cards, they can add mana, or they can deal damage. And that's kind of all a Magic card can do. And so if it's that limited of a number of options as far as interacting with the game, then reasonably, if you have a lot of cards that give you direct access to those mechanisms, then you can mix and match a lot of different things together. The important thing here then is if we want to have access to these kind of basic methods of interacting with the game, then we have to move away from cards that are prepackaged. There's the player is rewarded for playing Nekrataal or for playing Flametongue Kavu, but it actually gives them less access to the game system because it's an all-in-one package. So we need to have a set of cards that is more about moving into the particular ways in which you can interact with the rule system rather than interact with your opponent in that way. So if the idea of networks is going to work, and I'll explain that more in a second, if these small packages are going to work, then they have to be kind of raw in nature. They have to have the faceplate pulled off of them, and then you're actually interacting with the core components of the game. If you're using cards that are more self-sufficient, then you will less likely be able to pair them together in new and novel ways. All right, so one way to think about this is like, what is the cube, a theme park or is it a sandbox? I would say that a cube that is archetype driven is more like a theme park. There are rides that you can go on, and you can maybe ride this ride and then after that ride this ride, but in general you can't change the nature of those rides. Maybe you can experience them in a slightly different way. You can, I don't know, put a hat on or something like that. You can change your individual perspective minorly, but ultimately you can't change the ride. Whereas a sandbox, you can kind of do whatever you want, and that's the appeal to playing in one, right? That you have control over the sand, and you can use that sand to make something new. So I hope in doing this to let the players maximize their ability to create novel situations within the game. But these are all kind of abstract theoretical ways of talking about it. How do we do this? So as an example, I'm going to talk about Phyrexian Dreadnought. I've talked about this card a lot on this channel, but it's just the easiest way to look at it. Right? So Phyrexian Dreadnought is this kind of old-fashioned puzzle in Magic. They don't make cards like this anymore. They used to make these cards that were puzzles all the time. And basically, like, here's something really tantalizing, but you gotta jump through some kind of hoop to get it. As we said a little bit ago, like, the hoop ends up being too hard to jump through for a lot of cubes, so it's not worth it. But clearly it is worth it somehow because it's been a player in constructed at some point in time, right? Like different Stiflemont kind of decks. And that would be one way to do it. So the process of finding the maximum number of ways to use Dreadnought is just that. Like, how many different ways can we use this card in order to get value out of it? And then how can we use that answer to that question to make a cube? So here is the process of doing that is finding like the linear or more surface level example, which is typically related to constructed, and then everything else you can do with it. And the most typical thing you can do with a card like Phyrexian Dreadnought is Stifle the Trigger, right? The deck is called Stiflemont. So you're going to try to find some way to counter this ability, and there's a lot of them for cube now. There's Tail's End, there's Stifle, there's Tishana's Tidebinder, But you can also use phasing effects. You can use Slip Out the Back. You can use Galadriel's Dismissal. You can use a card like Stern Proctor or the Doorkeeper Thrall. All these cards that make it so trigger abilities don't happen. You can use Dress Down. These are all kind of ways to make sure that the trigger doesn't happen or is countered. And that's the most surface level way of using the card. And when I first put Dreadnought in the cube, people reasonably asked, is there enough support to get this to happen? And if your only way of looking at it is, I want to pair Stifle with Dreadnought, then maybe not. Now, there are appealing ways to do that. You can use Urza Saga to find Phyrexian Dreadnought, so you get a little more redundancy there. Or you can use, this card isn't in the queue, but you could use like a Trinket Mage to find it, right? There's ways to find it, so you have additional redundancy in finding Dreadnought. And then you have a Spell Seeker or a Micromancer to find your Stifle, and so on. And then that would make you have a little level of redundancy, and Trinket Mage and Trinket Mage and Spell Seeker and Micromancer. Those are all generically interesting cards for a cube anyway. So putting in Stifle, which is an all right card, and Dreadnought, which is kind of a worthless card in a sense, that is reasonable in a system that has these other cards. But it's probably not enough, right? Because the reward is good, but not that good. You don't win the game for getting a 1 mana 12/12. You get a 1 mana 12/12 trample, which is pretty good. Right? Someone is jumping the gun here, which is appreciated, right? So is there a different way that you can use this card, which is interesting? Well, what if you sacrifice Phyrexian Dreadnought to Alter Dementia, right? And you can mill 12 cards. I have lost to this multiple times now. It is the most efficient mill card in the game, right? And we'll talk about that level of efficiency in a second. What if you played Terror of the Peaks and then you played Phyrexian Dreadnought? What if you played Terror of the Peaks and then you played Phyrexian Dreadnought and then you used Ephemerate? You just straight up 24 damage to someone, right? What if you had Selvala in play and then you played Dreadnought with trigger on the stack, you activate Selvala and get 12 mana, draw a card. What if you have Greater Good in play and you sacrifice Phyrexian Dreadnought, draw 12 cards, and then discard 3 cards? All of these allow us to really tap into what's powerful about Phyrexian Dreadnought, which is that it has the number 1 on it, it has the number 12 on it. That is the powerful thing about this card. Now, most of the time those numbers are used to do damage to our opponent in the form of attacking with a trample creature, but it is the most efficient rate in Magic, as far as I can figure it out. The closest one is Life Goes On, right, which gains 8 life for 1 mana. So there has to be something that we can really extract from Dreadnought because it's the best rate. And if you think about other iterations on these ideas, if you have Alter Dementia and Underworld Breach in Phyrexian Dreadnought, that is more or less a 3-card combo that kills your opponent in the same way that Brain Freeze does. You can mill yourself once with Alter Dementia and then escape Dreadnought twice and just mill them for 24. It's probably enough to kill them. Terror of the Peaks is just a generically good card. It allows for lots of interesting combo possibilities. It's a 5-power flyer that's a nice threat. Selvala, it's a nice value engine. It generates a lot of mana for any kind of green deck. Greater Good is a more weird card, but it doesn't allow us to churn through the deck. You can think about how do I use Greater Good with Uro, for instance. That's a pretty powerful combination. And this gives us a number of different things to do with Phyrexian Dreadnought. So then the process would be, what do we do after this? Like, now we've taken, these are reasonably the maximum number of things we could do with Phyrexian Dreadnought. There are other things as well. You can use Ram Through, and you can Ram Through and punch someone in the face, essentially. You could use Berserk and Ram Through. But now that we have this little system of cards that go with Phyrexian Dreadnought, what else can we use with these cards? What if we had Scape Shift, Fields of the Dead, and Terror of the Peaks? Right? We just kill them immediately. What if we had Invigorate in Selvala, and we can use Invigorate to be a ritual in a sense? What if we had, with Greater Good, we use Uro? What if you had Teferi Temporal Pilgrim, which makes these tokens that whenever you draw a card, they get +1/+1 counter, or Teferi gets loyalty? You can very quickly pair together Greater Good and Teferi to just ultimate your opponent, because whenever you draw a card off of this, the loyalty on Teferi will go up. The point is, because these allow you to interact with the basic rules of the game, they will find a way to pair with other cards to create powerful opportunities. And so if we do this enough times over the course of building the cube, you will give the players a high number of possibilities to create unique combos. So another thing with doing this is you increase the amount of tension on any given card. Card tension is a term I made up, but it roughly means the variety of incentives to draft a given card, and that a card has low tension if it's a kind of card like Exhume, which has a specific purpose but is not even very good at it. And a card has high tension if it's extremely efficient or it can do a variety of number of things. And a lot of different people will want it. One of the downsides of using archetypes as your model is that you will put a lot of cards in the cube that have low tension, meaning that the person who ends up in that deck will likely get all those cards. And the draft is a process of sorting the cube out rather than deck building. Right? And if the cards have a high enough level of tension, then it becomes difficult to predict what card will wheel, and each draft decision becomes much more meaningful. Right? That if I'm presented with these two opportunities in a draft in a pack of 7 or 8 cards, well, that's too few. If I have 11 cards in this pack, right, I could say, well, this card is pretty narrow, but would give me an interesting, unique possibility, or this card is generically good. Can I bank on this card wheeling for me? A lot of the basic strategy of drafts is figuring out what card will wheel, and I want to make that as hard as possible, more or less, for a few reasons. One, if you can predict what cards will wheel, the draft again will move towards sorting the cube out rather than deck building, and a lot of the decks will end up being the same. The goal in all of this is to make sure that unique decks are created every draft rather than the same 10 decks or 8 of 10 decks are drafted every draft. Ideally, to me, each draft of 8 players creates unique opportunities for play and unique instances of gameplay in Magic. And if we put a lot of narrow cards that only have a singular use, even if they are good at making a thing happen, it's not worth it because that will just occur the same way every time, and the draft will not be exciting. So ideally, the tension on any given card is as high as possible. There are limits to this, of course. Every card, like some cards are just highly desirable. The obvious ones being actual power, like Moxes and Black Lotus. You're just never ever going to table those. But also cards like Swords to Plowshares, Lightning Bolt. These raw efficiency, extremely good interactive cards. They are hard to guess, right? But we can end up saying that basically we're talking about enablers and threats, and that efficient answers and actual power and mana they are harder to actually put tension on because people just naturally want them. I guess in that sense they're always high tension, but they're probably not going to wheel. I guess is the way of saying this. So I think if you structure the cube this way, then the draft becomes more exciting because it's a journey of figuring out what's going on rather than a journey of figuring out what deck you're being given. And it gives the player more agency and more ability to deck build and more ability to express themselves, right? More ability to bring their unique playstyle to the table. And as the cube creator, I can lay out for you tons of different little combos that are in there, but you will probably see something that I haven't seen. And in that sense, you will create an experience for you and the players you're playing with that you've probably never seen before. And to me, that's what's exciting about Magic. So I think that leads to a draft portion that is more interesting. So how do we make gameplay more interesting? I think by default, if we have a higher variety of decks, we will have a higher variety of games and therefore more interesting games. Magic can be kind of one of two ways. It could be a game that's about refinement or a game that's about exploration. And Constructed is almost always about refinement because you bring the deck to the table. There's a cultural conversation about how to build the decks. And unless you're part of a brewing team or a brewer yourself, you're probably not building your own deck. You're probably making small changes to an existing deck. Whereas in draft, there's always the possibility every time you play, you build a deck. And there's going to be more variety in gameplay if you don't play with a deck you've practiced with before, which also brings up a good point. Like all of these things increase the opportunity for error, which can be a downside for players. It is a downside for players in that they will perform worse, but it also creates novel situations. If you mess up, then it's something that you've never experienced before. If you practice something to death, then you probably won't mess it up, and it'll probably happen the same way it's happened every time, unless there's some kind of unexperienced resistance to that. So we're already set up in a good place for making dynamic gameplay, but how can we emphasize that even more? So as a basic rule here, this is very, like, it's a truism in a sense, but great gameplay can only happen when both players can take meaningful actions. This is just kind of the basis for it here. The game can only be dynamic when it is happening. It can't be that before the game is being played, and it cannot be that after the game is being played. And I will also argue that it can't be that when one player can't take actions. Prison has been a long-standing archetype in Magic, and it is one of the earliest things to the game. Like Alpha has Winter Orb, it has Armageddon, the Dark brings Blood Moon, right? Trinisphere, and I don't know, is that Fifth Dawn? I don't remember. But Prison has been a long-standing archetype. I think it's ultimately negative on the game. It has its place in eternal formats, but to me, we want the game to always be about I'm doing this and you're responding. I'm doing this and you're responding, and vice versa. What does Derek say here? There's a note somewhere here about constructed being about either refinement or destruction. Did you mean destruction? I see what you're. That's an interesting point. Meaning that you're either refining what's already there or breaking it and finding something new. Yeah. So, back on the point about prison, I think it's best to avoid prison situations because I think games are more exciting when we can both do things. Right? We can go back to the idea of power, and can you create a situation where both players feel powerful? It seems maybe contradictory, but I think a game format that's about power almost by default means that you don't feel powerless. And frequently in a lot of situations in Magic, when people play with quote unquote the best possible things, one player feels powerless because they've been shut out of the game in some way. There will always be someone that loses. That is the nature of the game. You can draw someone with Earthquake if you want to, but the point is there's always going to be a loser, there's always going to be a winner, but the game can be played in a certain way where both players can take meaningful actions from beginning to end of the game rather than one player being completely shut out of the game. So how can we make card inclusion and removal decisions based on this, right? The ultimate goal then is that we're going to emphasize the mid game, I don't mean mid-range decks. That's not what I mean. I mean we're going to emphasize after turn 3 or 4, and then before the final turn of the game, or before the final last 2 turns of the game, because those are where the bulk of the gameplay actions happen. So how do we do that? Right? We want to make sure that the game opens in a different way and the game ends in a different way. And some of this means that we're going to decrease consistency. And one of the ways in which we can open in different ways is literally by playing with power. Whenever you play with fast mana, you are changing the pace of the early game most of the time by getting more mana than you should have. So one of the advantages to playing with power is that you add a little bit of a randomization beyond the drawing 7 cards to the opening of the game. It's not exactly like random chess or something like that, but someone's going to have 1 or 2 more mana than they should, and as a result, one card's in play a turn earlier, and now you're presented with a different problem than you've experienced in a different game before because you've skipped to a different portion of the game. This is not to say that power is fair. Really, it's never fair, but it does provide a little bit of additional variety to openings of games, which I think is a net benefit. And the difficulty is then you don't want power necessarily to lead to the immediate end of the game. To me, you want to use it to shortcut to the exciting part of the game, which is the middle of the game, and not to bring us to the end of the game. Remember that players want to end the game, and that's reasonable because players want to win. But is there a way that we can still satisfy the desire to win, but also make sure the game happens? Sorry. Well, there are some ways. We want to increase interaction and decrease restrictions. So the I'm going to go ahead here. Let me back up again. One way to do this is to make sure that we don't have too many cards that end the game the exact same way every time, right? Because we want to have a variety in endings. There's, gameplay is excitement because we don't know what's going to happen next. If we know that on turn 4 they're going to play Archon of Cruelty and I'm going to lose the game, there can be tension there, like I'm going to lose or I can kill them or I'm going to lose, but it can be kind of a letdown because one of two things is going to happen. And it's not like I'm going to win or lose, it's Archon of Cruelty is going to kill me or not. So you can remove certain cards that lead to definitive endings like immediately. And that would, to me, there would be cards like Archon of Cruelty, Atraxa, there'd be Parallax Wave, notably, probably Minsc and Boo, things like that. The cards that end the game in like 1 or 2 turns that always end the game the same way every time. There'd be Gut, there'd be Bronze-Eyed Bombardiers, these things that do so much damage or provide so much value that the most reasonable course of action frequently is to concede. And that way, if we don't have these cards, then it's a little less predictable what the outcome of the game is going to be. And the game, you can be presented with a threat, but you can then respond in some way. So it brings us to the idea of interaction. You want the game to flow freely. There's 2 things that this means. It means you want to increase interaction here. This can be in the form of free spells, and they give the players opportunities to act more often than they normally would be able to. And it could just be the availability of certain kinds of interaction. Most often this means graveyard interaction. There's a lot of movement towards the graveyard in Vintage Cubes in general because of the power of cards like Reanimate. But I think those are like overperformed because people don't put graveyard interaction in the cube. So that could be cards like Turn the Earth, it could be cards like Cling to Dust, it could be cards like Soul Guide Lantern or Relic or Unlicensed Hearse or these things. You want to make sure that if something is possible of winning, then something is possible you've stopped. If that is both possible and recognized by the players, then they'll reasonably have a diversity of attack lines in their gameplay plan. So that way, when you disrupt this one, they can opt into this one, and the game will develop over time rather than happen or not happen. One of the kind of patterns that can happen a lot of the time in typical Vintage Cubes is that they are threatening a combo and you stop the combo and they can't do anything else, or they threaten the combo and they combo off and win. So if you stop that kind of gameplay from happening as far as definitive endings, then you can have a little less defined endings. I'm not trying to make sure that strategies aren't available. I have no interest in removing combo from the game. In fact, the whole purpose of all of this is to make sure that there's more combo and more synergy, and because most of the time it will not happen. But it doesn't mean that the specific instances of that combo or combo will necessarily be the best way to do it. If you want these things to be meaningful, then as far as the gameplay, there does have to be some kind of ability to respond, and it can't just be like have removal this turn or lose the game. So that's one thing as far as endings and interaction. But another thing you can do is decrease restrictions. So just reduce the number of prison cards that are available. So it'll be like Karakas, Mother of Runes, Broadside, I just have it out for that card, Hull Breacher and Orc Spellmasters. These cards that just stop your opponent from taking actions. They're really like, they serve a purpose maybe in Constructed, but I think here they end up just restricting the game, which is what the whole purpose of them is, but they strangle the excitement out of the game by stopping one player from playing. There's really, if we go back to the idea of being powerful, just because you're losing doesn't mean you should feel powerless. You can feel powerful as in you have agency even if you are going to lose. Right? You can make meaningful decisions and still lose. And if if the game ends up feeling like I can't make meaningful decisions and I'm going to lose, then it's not. It kind of ceases to be interesting, right? You end up trapping players in these kind of prisons of punishment. A lot of gameplay is about this person is succeeding, this person is losing, and therefore like this kind of idea of fun being one-sided. It doesn't have to be that way. The game can be a back and forth situation. Let me go forward here. Another idea is to, if you're going to have redundancy, which you need, and you need players to have the opportunity to do things on a consistent basis, you should put it in the cube through variety. Meaning, if there are things with similar inputs, have them have different outputs. If there are things with different similar outputs, you should have them have different inputs. That way, you still have access to those avenues of the rule system, but they produce different results or they come from different directions. Some examples here are Thought Scour, Hedron Crab, and Merfolk Secret Keeper. All of these cards mill, but they all provide different opportunities. Right? You can use Thought Scour with Snapcaster Mage to just fill your graveyard really quickly. You can use it as part of a Storm turn to draw. You can mill your opponent if they tutor in some way or they stack their deck. You can burn it off real quick without any kind of consideration, and then you can use it to trigger your Dragon's Rage Channeler, lots of stuff. The Merfolk Secret Keeper, you can very quickly mill. You can pair it with Doomsday for a one-turn kill. You can play as a quick blocker, right? You can play it and bounce it and play it again for a storm count. There's lots of things you can do due to the nature that it is 2 spells on 1 card. And then Hedron Crab, while it also mills, you can use it as a consistent mill condition. You can pair it with Scapeshift to kill them. You can mill yourself to find things like Uro on a consistent basis. Each of these things provide the opportunity to mill, but do so in different ways. So therefore, a deck can achieve what it wants in giving the players the ability to mill, but it creates a variety of situations that are created by using these cards. What else do I see here? Another thing you should do is, to me, if we want the game to play to be fluid, then we really need to remove binary cards. These are cards that are 0s or 10s. There are a couple advantages to this. It allows for smooth gameplay from beginning to end, but also allows for players to use their resources as much as possible and not just have a card waiting for another card in their hand. The basic gameplay pattern of these is always the same. I'm going to put this card with another card and win the game, or I'm not going to draw that other card and I'm going to lose the game. Right? Or the card is situationally extremely powerful, or it does nothing. Like Mind Twist, frequently, if you play it on turn 2 or 3, they'll discard their whole hand, or it does nothing later on in the game. Either they have no cards, or they have such a looming threat on the board that they lose. Some of these have become iconic with Vintage Cube and the gameplay patterns of it, but I would offer that they end up kind of representing a gameplay that is just ultimately negative and can be superseded. Now, this is not to want to remove combo. These are the ways that people consider combo a lot of time. I think the combo is what you need to pay attention to in cube construction. Otherwise, the other part doesn't need attention. Mid-range decks build themselves. But you do need to put specific attention towards constructing cubes with combo. So removing these cards is not to take combo out of the cube. It's just to change the nature of the combo. I view all of these kind of thoughts as additive. I'm not trying to remove any kind of particular strategy. I'm just trying to add things to fill out the gaps between them all. Another thing to create dynamic gameplay then is to reward continual investment, meaning you don't want too many cards that continue to pay out without additional input. Now, sorry, can't talk. The most iconic example of this kind of card is a Planeswalker. Planeswalker you pay mana for up front, and then it has continued output without additional input. And I think that's a lot of the weird people's frustration with that card type, is that this is kind of set and forget, and then it creates additional value for the person who plays it. But there are other ones like this, right? This could be Goblin Rabblemaster, it could be Ophiomancer. In this case, I have Ophiomancer paired with Sedgemoor Witch. Ophiomancer undoubtedly is just a more powerful card, but Sedgemoor Witch creates opportunities that lead towards novel game situations, whereas this leads to repetitive game situations. The goal is to create situations where the players have to make meaningful decisions, and therefore, like this one, while there are cool things you can do with Ophiomancer, it's going to create static game situations, whereas Sedgemoor Witch is going to create dynamic game situations. This is the same thing every time, and on Sedgemoor Witch, I have to alter my gameplay if I want additional value out of it. What else we here? No, we'll get back to that in a second. So that's a lot of talk about the decks there. So what is the result of all of this, if this long rambling makes any sense? The result of this, in my experience, and I've drafted this cube about 200 times or so, is that you end up with decks that have lots of possibilities to win with, and they have lots of possibilities to interact with their opponent, and that games in that sense are frequently a sequence of, I'm going to try to enact plan A is disrupted, I can recalibrate, move towards plan B, and then while I'm moving towards plan B, I can rebuild on plan A, things like that. It allows the players to build redundant decks, but that leads towards different outcomes because of providing variety to make redundancy. And that way the game doesn't play out the same way every time, but players are still able to take control over variance, right? They can have 12 random cards in their deck and they will accomplish something because all of them are interacting with the basic rules of the game in a sense, but they won't produce the same patterned outcome every time. That allows the players to interact in a new and interesting way in every game. What are some decks that I have? I built some decks that I can show you this with. I know, I'm sorry, Wacky. I know you love Elfimancer. At some point, I do have to take things away from players, and I've taken the most things away from you. So I do appreciate you still being around. Here are some possible decks you could do. This is a blue-white deck I built using the current cube list. That is essentially like a blue-white control deck, right? We have Teferi, we have Wandering Emperor, some elements of counterspells, there's power and time walk, but there are a lot of avenues towards victory. Most of the time, what will be different between these decks and the typical deck you'd see is, regarding other cubes, is that the ways they win are unique to that deck, right? Rather than using Jace the Mind Sculptor to win, or using Inferno Titan or Grave Titan and things like that. And so this deck uses different combinations of cards to create unique scenarios. We can combine together Scroll of Fate, Omniscience, and Yorion to put Omniscience into play for a cheaper amount of mana. We can use Twining Twins to put Omniscience into play. We can use Academy Rector and block with Academy Rector to get Kiorabas the Sea God. This deck has Replenish and lots of cycling enchantments or ways to discard cards. We can use Moonblessed Cleric to put a card on top of our deck and then put it face down with Cryptic Coat, and then we can flip it over with one of our blink cards with Displacer Kitten, things like that. You can imagine a line where there's Moonblessed Cleric, put Omniscience on top of the deck, cast Cryptic Coat, and then cast, I don't know, Path to Exile, use Displacer Kitten, flicker the upside down Omniscience, or just bounce Cryptic Coat to hand, replay it with the Kitten in play, flip this over. These all sound kind of outlandish things, but I will say just over the course of playing the game, they will happen. And really, very few of these cards are unusual or quote-unquote unplayable, right? A deck like this will get a lot of mana, and you can cast Kiorabas the Sea God with a regular degree of certainty. Every other card here is a pretty just decent interactive card. So you end up with something that plays like a blue-white control deck, but also has combo elements to it, right? And therefore, on each given turn, you have to weigh, how do I move my particular combo forward, or while also balancing, disrupting my opponent. One of the things this does is it makes players both play offense and defense simultaneously, rather than being able to build decks that focus on doing one of them. Players like to play very concentrated roles because it allows them to be safer, which is, again, a reasonable player desire. But from a gameplay perspective, it's frequently better for the players to be taking risk and to put themselves in danger. And it will be more exciting for them to be in danger. But players won't willingly walk into dangerous situations because it allows them to lose more frequently. Right? This is a mono red storm deck, which has some strange opportunities to it. You can use, it ultimately has Breach and Lion's Eye Diamond and some cheap cards here to some free artifacts, but you can use strange combinations like Unexpected Inheritance and Mind Collapse to target your own creatures, reveal a bunch of cards, use all your mana from the Honorable Breach situation to cast Elemental Eruption. One of the things that is frequently done in this cube is that multiple qualities of a card can be leveraged. So Fire Blast will both deal damage to my opponent in this red deck. It will sacrifice lands for Underworld Breach to help escape. It will be a spell for Empty the Warrens and for Storm, but it also will have a high mana value for Levon here, which says whenever you cast an non-creature spells, or a creature casts plus X plus 0 until end of turn, or X is the spell's mana value. So here we have a deck that's a red aggressive deck that also has lines to be a Storm deck, that also has lines to be a Goblin combo deck, right? And all of these cards are still put within a reasonable curve, have good interactive elements, and provide us opportunities to have unusual aggressive plans while still maintaining some kind of defensive plan. This is a deck I drafted, which is a kind of madman deck. I can't show you the whole curve because Emrakul is at the top here. But this is a Leyline of the Guildpact, Scion of Draco slash Food Chain deck. Right? I can use Food Chain in Scion of Draco in combination with Leyline of the Guildpact, or Leyline of the Guildpact, and use this to generate 13 mana to cast Emrakul. Or one play I did make was have Food Chain in play. I had Exocrine in play. I use it to wipe their creature, and then I can exile this for 4 mana. I can evoke Ingot Chewer, and then get exile this for 6 mana, and then cast Primeval Titan with get Field of the Dead online and kill my opponent there. These things, they sound ludicrous, but that's just how the deck plays. What else do I have here? This is another kind of blue-red storm deck, which uses Haze of Rage, which actually is no longer in the cube at this moment, but this uses Prophesydetic Memory, which just got added to Magic Only Vintage Cube. The point is these decks have a wide variety of aggressive opportunities, which means that not only will you have unique ways each game to move the game forward, but having it so there's a wide variety of small things that a deck does means that your opponent's interaction is more meaningful but not game ending. So your opponent will break up the small thing that's available to you, but you can recombine that card that you have left with another card in your deck that does something different. So I might have Sorin here to put Vein Ripper in play, but if they make me discard Vein Ripper, then I can use it with Sanguine Evangelist, right? I can sack this and then Recurring Nightmare back into play or something. Or I can use Sanguine Evangelist without these to keep Recurring Nightmare back these other cards. I'm beginning to lose my voice here. But the point is, if your opponent does disrupt your combo element, you still have a generic creature you can use, or you still have other things you can pair them with to create a different powerful combo. I can use Showdown of the Skalds with Pia, but I can also use Showdown of the Skalds, to just generate possible counters. So these decks end up looking a lot different than a typical deck for Vintage Cube, which frequently is either like a bunch of artifact mana and a bunch of big draw 7 spells, or a bunch of removal and a bunch of value creatures, or that's kind of about it, right? And they let you manipulate the game rules in a different way than you normally would be able to, and I think that creates new, different ways to play the game. Kind of running out of things here. The challenge from a player perspective is you will think about cards that you don't have. and they're not in the cube because there are cards that I got, like Traxa and Archonic Cruelty and Parallax Wave and Mother of Ruins and Karakas, and that's bordering on it. Minsk and Boo. Most of there's no initiative cards, there's no monarch cards, so those cards are not present. But just because you know that they exist doesn't mean that they would contribute towards a more compelling gameplay. I think it's difficult in Magic to forget the other cards that do exist, even if they create a scenario that is, I think, less good. And I hope to a degree that I've explained why some of these cards create a lesser gameplay format, and why I think that some of these would create a more interesting one. But this has been a long discussion at this point. So, I want to end this in some way, if it has kind of any meaning at all. Well, let's just say this, that when drafting this cube, oh, you can't even see what I have pulled up. I'm such a dummy. Okay. When drafting this cube, the question stops being what deck am I drafting in, the question starts being how can I use the cards that I am drafting? And I think that's a more interesting question to try to solve. And I think then the question when playing the game is, how is my opponent trying to use their cards in a way that I've never seen before? That's the net result of building the cube this way. I'm going to end this then with this kind of quote that I've talked about a lot on stream. Whether or not this is actually a John Cage quote or whether it's Marcel Duchamp, I'm not sure. Because the way he says it in the video is ambiguous. But one of the things that challenges us as Magic players is that we know all these things do exist and we want to play with them. But they can stop us from reaching a kind of maximal experience. And this John Cage quote, which I put on here a lot, is we don't have to have tradition if we somehow free ourselves from our memories. There's a lot of things that we continue to hold up as being the pillars of the game that really, I think, take away from us. Wizards has done their best to stop it. In some ways, they further the problem, but the ban restricted list exists for a reason. But there's still this kind of temptation to want to play with these cards that allow us to win the game very quickly. But I think, again, that we can create a game that allows people to feel powerful without making sure the game maintains functionality. Because at some point, it is inevitable that the game will be a turn zero game. Right? Like there will be enough cards printed that something will combine with something else to end the game on turn 1 or turn 2. And the question then will be, is this still a good game? There's always some kind of interactive element to a game of Magic, even if it's very fast and very few decisions made. But there does come a point where it's compressed enough to arguably cease to be the game that it is, right? Like if there's only 3 or 4 different points of decision and you didn't have a lot of time to react, or you didn't have a lot of opportunities, then how quickly are we moving towards rock, paper, scissors, or towards coin flipping, or just, as I said earlier, move towards playing spades or hearts or things like that. Now, every game is fun in its own way. I think Magic is fun in a very unique way. And so I want to try to explore what that is. That's all I've got. Any thoughts or questions, anyone? Thanks for hanging out. This has been a lot of discussion. I wish I had shown the decks, but I didn't. I'm a dummy. I think that, I think that Vintage Cube, as it's conceived of, is a dead end. And it will... You saw the decks? Sick! That it will continue to compress towards these 10 cards that I put up way earlier. Can I go through this whole thing again? Yeah. Oh, you saw them? I'm such a genius. that there's this will continue to be the metagame in Vintage Cube, and it will get more and more and more amplified. There's some reasons that this is the case. One of that is that people continue to play with commander cards, which are essentially designed for a different game at this point. There was a point in time in which creatures that were printed for in commander sets were necessary for creatures to be good in Cube because creatures were so bad in Magic for so long. I don't think creatures were good until 2018. The very few creatures that were printed that saw play and constructed were such exceptional designs. And any creature that was printed in a sense that was more in line with what a creature was conceived as being, then they almost never made the cut, right? Now creatures are a little maybe too good in standard, but I think they're kind of on par with where things should be. Like, as frustrating as Shieldred is to play with, then it's still a pretty good design, right? And one might say it's a great design. But the commander cards are just designed to do so much more damage, because if the creature is going to be meaningful, then it has to deal damage on a level that's 6 times higher than a normal game of Magic. And at some point, it's going to be too much, right? Gut does roughly 14 damage in the course of 2 turns. Is that okay for a 3 mana card? That you could say that it just dies to removal, and that's true. But again, if it's just about do I have removal this turn or not, then we move close to playing Go Fish. And one of the things that Magic can offer is that it has gradations of failure, in that you're allowed to fail a couple times within a game. Magic is extremely punishing towards mistakes, but it's not lose the game. And it's also punishing to missing an opportunity, like I didn't have the card in hand. But again, it's not lose the game. And when it is, that's when it usually moves towards banning and restricting, right? When you have 1 or 2 turns of agency, that's usually when cards are no longer legal. Or when it's expected that you have a card in your opening hand, like Leyline of the Void. That's when BNR comes in, drops the hammer. And Cube will move that way as well. Right? And unless there's some kind of voluntary restriction on the number of value-generating 3 mana threats that are put in a cube, then it's going to move more and more that way. One way to think of it is that if you evaluate cards from the same metric you would evaluate a card for standard, then you will create a format that's like standard. It's just by default. And to me, standard is control decks, mid-range decks, some kind of monocolor aggro deck, and then some kind of AB combo deck. One sick thing about standard right now is the Slogurk deck, which is not an AB combo deck. And that really highlights the design innovations made in the last couple of years as far as standard is concerned, which is great. But in order for those cards to really shine in Cube, particularly Vintage Cube, you gotta put some cards away. You gotta put the guts of the world away. Because why would you bother to try to put this combo together when you can do 10 damage every turn for 3 mana? And they're just going to keep making more of them. And then if it becomes about, like, is this card better than Lelia? Well, how much better can you get before the game becomes, like, have removal now or die? We're almost there already. So that's that. You had Time Vault and you just keep it 1 point. Different time, different goal. Good point. I had everything in this cube. This cube went through a lot of different iterations. It started off mimicking the Magic Online Vintage Cube about a year ago. So this would have been in April, May, or June of 2023. And then I played with White Plume Adventurer for the first time. And I was very dead set against Initiative when it was spoiled, for reasons I think everyone is. But then I played with White Plume Adventurer in that format, and I was like, not that bad. And it felt fairly fair and fairly interesting. So I wanted to investigate what playing with initiative would be like, and so I put lots of evasion in the cube. To me, if you put something in, you have to put a countermeasure in, no matter what. Otherwise, you're just letting something be the best thing for no really good reason. This has happened before in the Magic Online Vintage Cube, with Underworld Breach being really powerful because there was not an instant speed disenchant in the cube. So when I put the initiative in, the people that were playing with me got frustrated by it, and I totally understood. And I had a couple reactions to that. One is that I, as a mid-range player in general, had to, 2 or 3 years ago, redefine what that word meant, because mid-range decks used to be a death trap in Vintage Cube. You just didn't want to be the slow, grindy deck. It was bad time. But due to the changing card pool, you could build them in a different way that made them be fast enough to close the game and also disruptive enough to stop your opponent from winning. Usually you could interact, but you couldn't close, or you could close, but you couldn't interact. And there was a confluence of cards around 2021 and 2022 that lets you essentially play Delver in Vintage Cube. It was usually Boros, but it was effectively Delver. Play cheap threats and negate all your opponent's plays. So I felt that when people were frustrated with initiative, I challenged them to redefine what the word combo means, or redefine what control means. And I was sincere in that, but there are limits to things, right? And so initiative and creature decks were very dominant at that point in time in this cube, and then I figured, okay, well, if we're here, let's just do it all. So I added Time Vault and I added Demonic Consultation, and they didn't really overperform. I think they were good, but they didn't win in like every draft or anything. No more than different kind of decks that were available. And in fact, Boros was still the best performing deck. But there was a lot of frustration in general in the narrowness of the gameplay. Gameplay were either about initiative or about assembling one of these two combos. And then we wanted to continue to provide, when I say we, I create the general structure for the cube. A lot of the content of the cube is the product of discussion between me and my friend Appa. So a lot of the ideas are posed by one of the two of us, and then it's iterated, and then I put it in the cube. So we wanted to explore, like, if it's going to be this world of mid-range decks or these two combo decks, how can we expand on that? And that became expanding the ideas, interacting with the resource system, and using delve cards with Up the Beanstalk and so on. And then eventually we found enough of these weirdo little combos. Like, it was really compelling to me to go turn 1 Lightning Bolt your opponent, turn 1 Mountain Lightning Bolt your opponent, turn 2 fetch Volcanic Island, Manamorphose, Fire Blast your opponent, play Murktide Regent. Right? That was like, wow, this is a sick kind of way to play the game. And I found that way of alternate resource manipulation, things like that. And that ended up being more interesting to me. So I decided to move the cube towards that kind of gameplay, which is almost like word association, right? Like, what does this card link with this card for? There's a lot of this cube's based a lot on like almost wordplay, or it's like a big run-on sentence in a way. So those cards were in for a while. I feel like it was necessary to move through them to get to this point in the design, but they ended up taking away more than they added. In a study in Harmony, I ended up cutting power for the same reason, that ultimately I found a format that I think was interesting enough, and that the power took away from that format. So I took the power out. In this case, one of the things about exploring alternate costs and cost reduction and things like that is that you're replicating power. And as a result, like these cards that allow you to do things in the mana curve at an unexpected time, they will fit more appropriately in a system that allows the players more opportunities to do that. So a cube that has Simian Spirit Guide and Elder Spirit Guide, which this cube doesn't at the moment, but just as some examples, or a wide variety of pitch spells or delve or things like that, that cube will be a more natural fit for power because everything is trying to break the resource system. But I wouldn't have gotten there without the pressure of initiative and Time Vault and Demonic Consultation. So that's the answer to the Time Vault. I personally think Time Vault is a worse combo than Entomb Reanimate Archon of Cruelty. It's 2 mana, it's 4 mana, it's twice as much mana. If you disrupt really either piece of it, the combo doesn't do anything. Like Archon of Cruelty is still a castable spell, and then Reanimate's still a pretty good spell too. Like maybe that's being strange about it, but when Time Vault comes into play, it doesn't provide any value. So if you shatter the Time Vault, then the combo is just disrupted for nothing, right? Whereas if someone reanimates a creature and you remove the creature, then they still probably got some kind of value out of it. That didn't used to be the case. It used to be that you could like really power through. The Evil points out technically the Time Vault doesn't win the game. That does come up, actually. But you used to be able to power through reanimate targets, but the printing of Atraxa, Archon of Cruelty, and Atali means that you kind of can't anymore. Those provide so much value now that if 2 of them get into play, then you're like 95% to lose the game. Whereas before it was like even when Archon was printed, you could kill the Archon and then you have to deal with like Terastodon or Woodfall Primus or things like that. And those cards are just so comparatively weak that they didn't the deck was pretty weak to 1 or 2 pieces of interaction. And that kind of comes up to the old kind of play pattern, right? Like I assemble my combo and I win, or if you disrupt it, I lose. So we're back to like a kind of binary game set. Whereas this has some of that. Like if I assemble Sorin and Fane Ripper, I probably win the game. But if I don't, I can still use Sorin to pump up. Let's say I had Bloodghast in this deck. Oh, you can't see it. God damn it. Okay. Let's say I had Bloodghast in this Vampires deck. I can use Sorin to combo with Bloodghast and sack it to deal 3. So one of the advantages to building combo decks in this manner is that if disrupted, I can still use my game pieces. Right? But I do think Time Vault is fine to play with. It is pretty boring in a sense. But I don't think it's that much more powerful than anything else. I would say if you want to play with Time Vault, you need to have a high degree of interaction for artifacts. Though. There are lots of ways to stop it. Any other questions or thoughts? Well, again, thanks for hanging out. I'm not sure I accomplished what I intended to do. If this was an introduction to the cube or just my thought process, I don't know. In order to learn to draft a cube, you kind of just have to spend some time with it. But it does reward increased investment. There was a time that you thought Vintage Cube on MTG was more like what you want. I think there are things about the MTG of Vintage Cube that are unrecognized. This is less true now. But let's say up until last year. I think one of the things that happened when things like lands was introduced in the winter is that people objected to being forced to draft this thing or being given like a pre-made deck to draft. This is for a long time been a complaint from players. Think about Blue-Green Madness and Standard. Right? They didn't like the idea of R&D creating a deck for them. But Magic is not a natural resource. Someone always makes these cards, right? And in order for the game to function in a certain way, they have to make them in a way that lets you play them that way. There seems to be this operational model among players that like these cards are randomly generated, and then it's the players that determine what's the best way to play it. But someone made them, And as a result, someone probably thought of the interesting things you can do with them. If they didn't, then the game would be worse. So my point there is that the original Vintage Cube had things about it that are assumed to be natural now. It's pretty regular for humans to assume that what exists when they show up is natural, and what comes after is unnatural or new or things like that. Right? So there is a high number of cards in those older lists for reanimation. Right? There's usually Exhume. There's like one of the reasons that, and this is still true, one of the reasons that Reanimator is the most popular deck, or one of the most popular decks, is not just because it's like a pretty easy combo to recognize. It's that there's so much support for it. And there's like 10 or 12 giant creatures that no one can ever cast. And there's a bunch of reanimation spells, right? There's a bunch of discard outlets. And when you point out, when you ask someone about this, they'll be just like, well, that's a Reanimator. And it's like, well, someone made the conscious decision to put that in the cube. And it was just assumed to be part of the landscape, but that was part of the creation of the cube. So it was interesting to me to see people say that Scapeshift decks or similar kinds of Valakut decks felt like something that they were either opted into drafting or not, when that was already the case for Reanimator. And Storm is the same way. Like, Storm is full of these cards that don't really do much else, but they're planted to create the Storm situation. And they, as a result, like, there was a Storm deck, and you could draft the deck or you could not draft the deck. And so that cube kind of always worked on this model. When I was discussing some of this with my friend, we determined that it would have been possible to build the Vintage Cube differently in that year, in 2011, 2012. But it was built in one way. Like, that's just the nature of history, right? Like, something happened, and as a result, we live in the world where that thing happened. And, well, that doesn't mean that is what had to happen. And given the collection of cards that was available in 2010 or 11, you could have built a very different cube. And we would be living in a different Magic world at that point. And because assumptions that were now considered natural, things that were now considered natural, would be considered new innovations or things like that. So, I don't know. I feel like my own understanding of the possibilities of the format and the format itself evolved over time. So I had fun, and it's not like it's not fun to be had, for sure. But I do think that the number of possibilities you can do has diminished. So, cool. Well, I guess that's it for me. Thanks for hanging out. I don't know the details on it, but there may be an event featuring my cube in a digital form, not officially on Magic Online or anything, but just available to draft. You would need a rental of some kind or card availability. And so if you want to explore this, let me put the link to the cube in here. If you want to check it out and give it a chance to play, then you can do that. I think personally I'm going to spend a little less time playing Magic in the future. I feel like I have kind of solved what I wanted to do, and my goal is never to be a great player. I'm a pretty mediocre player, but I think that this cube and the other cubes I've worked on have sufficiently answered the question of, like, to me, how do you create something that is rewarding to improvisation? Like I said earlier, my own background is in jazz music, and I don't know if I said that or not, but that is my like artistic background, and as a result, it's not surprising to me that the ideas of living in the moment and improvisation are important. And I think that Draft and then Cube in particular is the place in Magic that is the most possible to emphasize. Magic itself is a game that like has a lot of possibility of improvisation because there's so many game pieces. I said it earlier, but I think it's important to think about that it is the most articulated game ever created by humans. And what do I mean by that? I mean every game has a rule system, but think of it like a resolution in a video game, right? Like some games have 8 points of interaction, right? And there's 8 different ways you can do it. Some games have 12, some games have 20, and so on. Magic has so many unique ways to interact with the game system that there's just not another game like it. And to me, the role of design should be to embrace as much of that as possible. As I said, players will naturally try to winnow down these because consistency and redundancy are the friend of someone who wants to win. And that's perfectly reasonable, and players will do what leads them to winning. That's their goal, right? But as a designer, I think that the goal should be to push the players in as many unique directions as possible. And then that amplifies their challenge. One of the things I thought about that is unique about Magic with respect to games, and in that sense, every game that mimics Magic, is that it is incomplete when given to the players. And the final version of the game is not created until two people sit down with two decks. Before that, the game isn't not complete. And that's the nature of a deck builder game, right? That you are given components, and the game is like 90% done. And then you do the last 10% of the work, and then you play the game. There's a lot of huge benefits to this. One of the reasons the game sells so well is that it allows you to have a project. It allows you to put yourself in the game. It allows you to express yourself. It allows you to feel seen, right? Like the whole point of the psychographics is to understand why people are playing this game. And a lot of that has to do with they get to make the finished product. On the other hand, there are downsides to that because the goal of the player is not to make a great game. The goal of the player is to win the game. So when you give them 90% of a game, there's a strong chance that in their final 10%, they will diminish the quality of the game. And that's just the nature of Magic. And that by design cannot be overcome unless you play Cube. You could say that maybe that can be overcome in Draft, but there are other variables in Retail Draft. Retail Draft meaning Booster Draft in general. Magic has other demands on it. Like it has financial demands. So you have cards put up rares to sell packs. Players don't like this, but the company must continue, so therefore they must give players reasons to buy packs, and that means rarity, right? There are cards that are made for the game that are not for limited. So their quality will not enhance limited. They will probably detract from limited. There are cards that are made for fun reasons, so as in like silly reasons. Right? They don't, and they still do it. Like we think of that as like unsets, but like in general, there are usually wacky cards in every set. Not Captain Wacky, that's like Grave Titan, but no, just like silly cards, and those cards probably won't see play in Retail Draft. And that's fine. There's always some cards that are not being played, but that means that some part of the game is not maximized in the game. So then that leads us to Cube. And what's interesting and unique about Cube is that you, as the designer, have total control over the game pieces that are being played. And like I said, in Constructed, you don't, because players will create a sub-game of the game that you give them. And retail drafts, there are cards, game pieces that are made for non-game reasons, so therefore they're not maximizing the game. This is totally fine because the game is a commercial entity, and that's good. One of the reasons we have so many cards is because Magic is about making a great game, but it's also about making money. And it's easy to think of the capitalistic elements of Magic as being bad, but we would not have this game without the financial system involved in it, right? Because there's just no way that this many game pieces would be made. I'm not saying there's not some elements of greed or things like that. I don't personally see it that way, but there is an upside to the financial element of the game, which is that it incentivizes more game pieces to be made. Deadlines mean things get done. So then, I think cubes should be created in a way that the designer can maximize the output of the game, because every other format for Magic doesn't. Or maybe I just think that because that's what I like to play. Cool. I will run drafts of this cube at some point. I don't know when. It's difficult to find players in general these days. There's a lot of Cube and Magic Online, and then there's other cubes being drafted too. But what'll happen? We'll find a way. Cool. If you have any questions about anything really, but particularly about this cube or some of my thoughts about cube in general, you can feel free to DM me on Discord. For now, I'm going to be signing off. So, thank you. See you next time.